دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me in the ITV networks. Today with a very powerful, dynamic and young spokeswoman. She's also a professor in psychology at the University of South Africa, and I must say that after engaging with her, she has actually become a mentor and a role model for me. I think that many young South Africans can learn much from Professor Puleng, and especially the kind of work that she's doing. Professor Puleng has worked with various communities, especially women in South Africa, and she focuses on her stories, not his story or his story, but her stories, and it's a new genre of qualitative visual evidence of oppression and desire. But this will come out in the conversation that I have with her, and I'd like to say thank you very much. Finally, a whole year after meeting you, I have this opportunity to interview you.
Yes, finally. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, your work is actually very unusual, because I think even in the way in which you presented it, you refer to it as her story and not a history. You look at oppression and desire in South Africa. You look at mapping the imagination as part of healing, etc. What brought you to all of this? And I must also, right at the start, say thank you very much to UNISA, and you're part of UNISA and the Decolonial Summer School, for the opportunity in raising all of these questions. And I suppose the interrogation probably started with that for you as well.
Yes, as you said in the beginning, I'm in the field of psychology, and I'm always fascinated about understanding people, the way in which they relate to one another, the way in which we engage with one another within our families, within our communities. And as someone who grew up surrounded by very powerful women who had to go through their own struggles as well, I was then very fascinated with the story that women had to tell or have to tell. And growing up, having gone to school and university, and looking at some of the stories that were told or that are being told, and finding a lot of silences in terms of the contribution that women have made, that women are making, I thought it very important, and I took it on as a project to look at the stories of women, to look at the struggles of women, to look at the various oppressions that women have gone through, and many are still going through. And therefore I ventured into looking at her story or her stories, and looking at the various ways in which women are resilient, in which they express their desires, their passions, and in which they deal with the various pains that they experience in their lives. So with that, I looked at the idea of trauma and the way in which it is understood within the psychology discipline, but also troubling that a little bit and looking at how we can broaden or expand the way in which we define trauma, the way in which we look at trauma. And I was very educated by the women within the communities that I worked in, that I work in redefining what trauma is, or how trauma can be understood. So that's more or less one of the projects that I'm involved in.
So much of what you say actually is also part of a decolonial perspective, that you allow the voice of those whom you are engaging with to come to the fore. And you said it's a very powerful comment for me that you were educated about redefining trauma by those women. So it's a special definition which they give in their interpretation and understanding, isn't it?
Exactly.
And so does the decolonial approach then make it easier or open up greater avenues for understanding these kinds of issues, structural violence? I know you focused a lot on that, especially in terms of, and is this mostly related to the black woman in the rural areas, in the different communities, etc.? Is it post or pre-apartheid, etc.? What kind of violences are you looking at, and how does the decolonial perspective then allow you to expand that narrative?
The idea of violence, and I think in many ways, or often when we think of violence, we're thinking of beating each other up, right, or shouting at one another.
Subjective.
Yes, but violence happens at various levels within our lives and in our bodies. We're talking about structural violence, emotional violence, and the various forms of violence that people experience during apartheid and even before apartheid, and how that then continues to affect the way in which people experience their lives on daily, and the way in which they engage with their families and their communities. So the idea was to then again entangle that a little bit and look at how these forms of violence have affected people, and how people have managed to overcome that and still be able to then continue with their lives. And in many ways, also interrogate and look at how this violence continues within people's lives. So not violence within the family only, domestic violence or violence in the workplace, but the other subtle forms of violences that people also experience. The fact that a child has to go to school and maybe there are no books for them at school, that is also a form of violence. The violence where people are living within areas where there are no resources that are necessary for them to be able to live a dignified life, that is also a form of violence on a person's humanity. And oftentimes you find that women are at the receiving end of this, because most of them are carers, most of them are breadwinners, most of them are found within communities where they build these communities, and they are faced with these various forms of violences. And the way in which I see myself linking to decolonization is that you need to broaden the way in which we understand things. We need to be able to redefine things for ourselves. And again, being able to provide people with a lens, an opportunity to define things for themselves as well. So again, looking at people as subjects who have agency, who actually have a voice, and assisting in ways that we can to be able to provide that platform for them to be able to voice their experiences for themselves.
You speak about something which is very close to my heart, and that is about the woman, and especially working women who are at the receiving end of all these different types of violences, which I think many people ordinarily do not speak. And I'm going to speak specifically in terms of the Black South African woman who has to carry very many jobs, roles, positions, etc., in order just to eke out a living for herself. In your investigation, did you look at the domestic worker, the one who stays away from home, who has to nurture everybody else's family but her own, and the impact of that? Because for me that is violence, where you are forced to express this love. Maybe, I mean, I don't say forced, they do it voluntarily and I know genuinely, but at the same time their own children are deprived of that kind of an emotion and that kind of support, etc. To me that's a very painful picture, and I want to know, did you encounter any of these discussions and how these women respond to this?
Definitely. That was one of the things that did come out. I work with much elderly women, and you can imagine somebody having to remember to go back to a time when they were a child. And we're talking about migration, we're talking about leaving the home in search of a better life, or leaving the home so that you can go make money for your children. And as a child, that is something very difficult to understand. And in the work that I was doing, that did come out, where some of the women were talking about how they felt unloved, how they thought their mothers abandoned them when they left, because in leaving them, they were looking after other people's children while they had their own children as well. And I think one of the things that made the work even powerful was that I did not just only rely on just engaging with the spoken, the language, but we also included visual ways in which stories could be told. So the women also made embroideries of their experiences, and one of the embroideries was focusing specifically on that, focusing on the rural areas where the woman grew up and showing the route and trajectory of the mother having left the family and having this picture of a mother carrying a child and saying, she's carrying a child, but that's not me, that's not her child. I'm down here, and I never really got to feel my mother's love. I never got to be in my mother's back and be able to experience what it's like to be one with my mother and feel her warmth. And that was a very painful thing, but at the same time understanding that the mother loved me so much that she actually left me so that she can go and make money so that I can have a better life growing up. I did not understand that as a child, but growing up I understand that it's because of the love that she had for me.
So we have to go to a break, and I'm very emotional right now, so I think it's at the right time. Well, when we come back, I just want to focus a little bit more on this before we go on to the other discussions. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today at the ITV Networks with a very dynamic, young, beautiful woman, and that is Professor Puleng. And Professor Puleng, before we went into the break, we were speaking about this kind of emotion and the violence that many women in South Africa face, and I think many of us, when we look at them, we do not realize the kind of pain and the kind of violence that they carried, and that is particularly, and I'm touching on this because many of you are in that situation where you have domestic workers. It's time that we open up our minds and our understanding to what these women are going through so that we can be more empathetic and more supportive. Now, before we went on to the break, you were explaining about this story, and you said that, you know, in doing this research, you felt it was important to go back into the communities and discuss with the women after your research has done. And I know that they particularly look forward to that point where you come back and give them feedback to show them that they were not just part of an experiment, but that they now form a community which you care about. Was that important for the woman?
Yes, I think it was important for me, and it was important for the women as well. And I felt that it was important for them because they opened up the space and opened up themselves to engage with the work once more. I think one of the projects, or one of the ideas of decolonization, is that we don't look at people as sources of data. We don't look at our communities as people whom we can extract information from so that we can publish and write whatever it is that we want to write and make names for ourselves, but also that we acknowledge what they have to give and also treat what they provide us with dignity as well. And for me, that is an idea towards that project. So I have established a relationship with the women that I was working with, that I continue to work with. And recently now in December, again, I spent some time with them where we reflected on the work and revisited some of the things that we had engaged with and looked at what has happened since we did the work and where we are now. And again, just an opportunity for us collectively to engage with one another. And the way that we did it was that it was not only us, so the women who were collaborators in the project, but we also opened it up and invited other women from the community to also be part of that conversation. And also some of them brought their daughters with them so that this engagement can also be an intergenerational conversation and engagement, which I thought was also very important and useful, because as you know, when it comes to issues of violence or abuse or very hurtful and painful stories, sometimes it becomes very difficult for mothers to talk about those with their daughters, or grandmothers to talk about those with their daughters or their granddaughters. And within a space like this, then it becomes somewhat easier for such conversations to happen, because if they don't happen, then we're bound to repeat them again and not learn from one another.
Now, considering that you spoke firstly to the older woman, obviously it was a context and a time that was in many ways different to what we're living in. But now that you brought in the younger daughters and perhaps the granddaughters, do you find that there is a mind shift change in which they view all of these things, the circumstances, the poverty, the structural violence, etc., are they less likely to be accommodating of it? As the older woman, I think, were much more patient, much more tolerant, and carried big shoulders. Is there a change in the way the younger generation views those kind of hardships as to the way in which the older generation views it?
I think in many ways yes, and in some other ways no, because people develop ways in which to try and deal with the challenges that they're experiencing in life, and the issue of support is also very critical and very important. Hence, it's so important for daughters to know that they can speak to their mothers, or for mothers to know that they can speak to their daughters. So for me, this intergenerational conversation is very important, and because the hurts and the experiences are in our bodies, and we need to find ways to be able to externalize or verbalize that. But just again, coming back to you asking whether it's easier or more difficult for the older one and easier for the newer generation, we look at society, we look at what people are exposed to, and we look at how things have changed in terms of people's rights and having the ability and space to be able to talk about issues. Maybe in some ways, for younger generations, many platforms are there, but when it comes to the older generations, maybe those platforms were not there, because they were not protected by law, or they were not protected within the communities that they were in, because they had other struggles to fight, and they had to compartmentalize what they deemed as things that they could focus on or sort out later. Whereas now, with all the possibilities that are there, spaces are there for people to engage at various levels.
Working with rural women and working especially with black women in South Africa, in your interrogations and your discussions with them, what do they view perhaps as the number one cause of violence in their lives? Like, how do they view violence? Do they view it firstly, in terms of their own environment, like a black on black violence or domestic violence or patriarchal violence? Or do they consider first the structural forms of violence to which they have been forced, been compartmentalized into it? Or do they bring it all together and see it as a complete situation? Do they recognize these other forms of violences, or are they also trapped perhaps in the very limited circumstances and surroundings in which they are in? Is it a challenge for them?
It is a challenge for them, but in my engagement with them, what I saw and I found as being profound is that they don't compartmentalize, but they look at these things as being interrelated, right? So they would focus a lot on the role that apartheid played in limiting people's options. They looked at the role that apartheid played in the disintegration of families because of the restrictions that were there as well. So even though you might know where your mother works, or you might know where your father works, you can't get there even if you wanted to. So while you might have some sense of resentment that your mother does not come to visit you or your father does not come to visit you, you also understand that it's the system that you lived under that also contributed to that, while you may also maybe hold them responsible or accountable in some ways. So it was actually very refreshing in many ways, because I think it's easier for us to want to categorize or compartmentalize.
And that's a very Eurocentric perspective,
yes,
isn't it?
Because
by doing that, by compartmentalizing, by prioritizing, you actually then shift the focus to what is perhaps maybe the greater problem.
Exactly. And that assisted me again in just sitting back and saying, hey, wait a minute, actually we can understand things holistically. Within that holistic understanding of things, you can see where what fits in, but then also understanding that you cannot understand it or look at it in isolation without taking into consideration the other factors. Because when you do that, then it becomes easy to lay blame.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that brings I think to the fore two important things. One, that the indigenous knowledge or that the indigenous perspective has in many ways retained its authenticity away from that influence of the Eurocentric perspective, etc. And secondly, that these women are very resilient, yes, in that they have maintained their memory, but not only that, they are cognizant of all the factors, of all the issues, etc. And so they function within this holistic environment to try and find solutions. And so would you then say for them, recollection, memory, mapping the pain, etc., was very important, and in a way, does that negate much of what the kind of work that the TRC did?
In many ways, yes. Actually, while I was doing my work, I was also interrogating the TRC transcript, because again, the idea is to think about forgiveness, is to think about moving forward, is to think about where we are as a people, and what are the negotiations and engagements that we need to go through and engage in. And again, talking about what story matters and what doesn't matter. So who gets to decide what story gets told? So as I was engaging with the women, they deemed it important and in a useful space for them to be able to engage with what they were going through, and looking at that against the process of the TRC, one could see that sometimes when things are too scripted, mm-hmm, then it becomes a bit restrictive in terms of what gets told and what remains untold, and also who gets to interpret what is being told and what it means. So yeah.
in the South African landscape, then, in terms of our painful history, the nightmare of our past, in terms of the memory and the untold stories, do you think, because the TRC is hailed as this victorious, phenomenal process that have brought much healing to South Africa, etc., for the majority of the population who are still dealing with their scars and still dealing with their wounds and still dealing with their memory, do you think that they see the TRC in the same way as the international community perhaps paints the TRC?
I think sometimes the one who experiences, the one who lives something, is the one who better understands what is going on. What we see on television, how things are portrayed sometimes, could tell a particular story. There was a bit of space, but I think that the TRC has played, and maybe for 1 or 2 or 5 people, it actually provided that process of just revisiting the past and rethinking what happened. But in many ways, and in conversations with people, in what has been written, and in my own investigations as well, when looking at the TRC transcript, I feel that it really left a lot wanting. It really left a lot of space for hurts and woundedness to still prevail and left hanging. And in many ways, the rainbow that it was hoped to have been, I think, is an incomplete one.
So we're almost at the end, and I want you to tell me, perhaps for you, what was your most powerful anecdotal moment, your most powerful experience, or as a story or an encounter that you experienced throughout this journey that you've been on, and especially in terms of uncovering the stories and the narratives of the women of South Africa?
Sure, that's a very difficult question. Because it's an ongoing experience, an ongoing journey, and there are moments of reflection. I think I was just humbled and in awe, being together with the women and just seeing how they allowed themselves to be vulnerable and allowed themselves to feel, because it's very important to allow yourself to feel, because then you can break the knots that are inside you. And just being or given an opportunity or being allowed that space by the women themselves to see their vulnerability was a very humbling experience for me. And I think as people, if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to allow ourselves to show the pain and for others to see the pain, then that can be a process of healing, and that can be a process of actually rethinking the way things are and how we can together move forward as a people.
And that tells me again and reaffirms my faith and my belief in South African people that we are a very generous nation. And I think the women of South Africa particularly, and particularly the black woman, are a very generous people. So thank you very much for being here and for sharing these experiences and this knowledge with me and with my audience. Till we meet again, fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار.